This is the Fundamental Escape Podcast with your host, Mark Fitzgerald. I'm David Werba, and this is episode 13. We have Paul Young on the show today, also known as William Paul Young, who wrote the book The Shack, which only sold about 22 million copies, no big deal. And he just released his latest book, Eve. I have to say it was a great pleasure listening to Paul speak. He's a very wise man. He talks a little about the positive feedback he received from readers of The Shack, which he said he has thousands of stories about. But he also mentioned some of the negative feedback he received from the Australian denomination of Christianity that banned The Shack as heresy and directed their pastors to warn their congregation to stay away from it. He also talked about the protesters outside a church he was speaking at that were carrying bullhorns and picket signs, and he found out that none of them even read his book once he started speaking to them personally. Paul says he writes his books around questions and says one good question is worth 1,000 answers in his book Eve. He also feels his books assist in the healing of the human heart. He says the shack is the house on the inside that people help you build, and God is not there to destroy the shack. He is indwelling it in order to help us reconstruct and participate in our healing. Now, regarding Paul's personal beliefs, he says he has a great affection for the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but he has pushed away from religion and says that religious systems have done some good things, but have also caused incredible damage and devastation as well. And then he leaves us with the quote, "Jesus didn't come to start a new religion. He came to show us what it's like to be fully human and fully alive." I love that. Now let's get to the podcast with Paul Young.
Cool. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fundamental Escape Podcast. Thanks for joining me. I'm here today with Paul Young, who's best known as the author of The Shack, and his new book has just come out, which is called Eve, which is another novel. So, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself there, Paul, and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do from day to day?
Sure. I'm 60 years old as of this year. My full name is William Paul Young, which is sort of funny because a lot of the books have William P. or they have W. Paul, or it's all kinds of mixes. And I'm one of 4 generations of Williams, none of who go by William. We all go by our middle names. And Paul is what I've been known all my life. But on the first little manuscript for The Shack, I wrote, The Shack by Mackenzie Allen Phillips, who is the main character in the novel, with William P. Young. And it was just a joke because I made 15 copies at Office Depot, so it wasn't like I was intending the world to read this thing. And what happened was people eventually who got a hold of this little manuscript started trying to contact us so that they could come to Portland, Oregon and have coffee or supper or lunch with Mackenzie because they thought he wrote the book. And the other funny thing was I started getting calls from people who knew me. And they'd go, "Paul, have you read this book by this William Young? I mean, he thinks just like you." So it was hilarious, and I love it. I love that sort of piece has been kind of floating in the middle of all this, just so that everybody knows I'm not quite that serious. I'm married. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's funny. I just wanted to throw out there, it was funny you sort of bring that up because when I first became aware of The Shack, there was sort of this mysterious kind of floaty idea around it, like who is this person, and is like there was kind of these almost like conspiracy theories around it, like is this based on a true story, like what's going on, like it's quite funny. So
some people got really offended that it wasn't like even though it said novel, even though it said fiction. They got kind of, and it's because I think it is so stunningly human that,
right.
And it's real. So I tell people all the time, in terms of fiction, it's not real, but this is it's a true story, like any parable is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I'm glad you used the word parable because I was actually going to make that complete connection with obviously Jesus spoken parable, and
it's all fiction.
Yeah, it's incredible to me.
I wrote this little piece about Andrew, the disciple Andrew, and he's after a long, hard day of hanging around Jesus and the crowds and all that. Andrew was this disciple that was kind of a young, his big brother Peter is sort of the main guy, and so he was always on the fringes. He's the one that found the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and I mean, he's just always doesn't know if he really wants to be identified with this group or not, and so he's having a rough day, and a guy comes over, sits down next to him, and he tries to ignore him, pretend he's asleep or something, and finally looks over and the guy's waiting. And he goes, great, he's going to ask me about Jesus. And sure enough, the guy says, so who is he? And he goes, oh, here we go. Who's who? Who, you mean Jesus? He says, no. Who is the Good Samaritan? And Andrew went, you want to know who the Good Samaritan is? He says, yeah, it's really important to me that somebody can actually change that much. And he says, this is a parable. Guy says, yeah. What's a parable? And Andrew has to try to explain to him that, this is actually true, but it's not real. And parables have a way of touching us. Fiction does. Creative work does. Has a way of touching us deeply and sort of connecting the disparate parts of our soul together, because we're all created to be stories. So this element of parable, I think you're absolutely right. I think I write parables. I think all 3 books that are novels are parables: Shack, Crossroads, and now Eve.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, just to preface this whole conversation, I just want to throw it out there, like, from experience. I did briefly mention to you, my experience in reading The Shack and what it meant for me. I mean, a friend of mine gave it to me in a time where I was in a huge point of crisis. So I had some, period of complete burnout and had to sort of rebuild my faith from the ground up. And had to start asking these questions of, like, what do I believe anymore? Like, I went essentially, the short version is that I went from this person that was absolutely sure of everything I believed to just, like, where am I and where do I belong and what is this all about? And somebody gave me The Shack and I read it and I was just like, and like you said, I totally resonate with what you said. It is such a human story. And it honors our own humanity. And that's what I appreciate about it, because I guess you probably know as well as I do, when you tend to grow up in the church, as I have, you get sort of handed these ideas of, like, it's all about Jesus, and you kind of lose the sense of your own, you stop honoring your own human story. And that's a huge part of what I'm hoping to do with these conversations in this podcast, is to say, a lot of the people we're connecting with are church burnouts, as I like to call them, people that have been through the system and kind of gone, oh my goodness, like, I still want to be a person of faith, but I don't want this religious dogma. Where do I begin to sort of navigate? And I just wanted to say, that's what I appreciate about your work and what you do. And so I guess by that way of thinking, I'd be keen to sort of hear from you. I do want to talk a little bit about the controversial side and the sort of negative feedback from The Shack, but on a positive sense, I'd be keen to hear, like, what sort of stories have you heard? When did you start sort of getting feedback from people from The Shack, and is there any sort of significant stories that you could share that stick out about it?
You're asking for a week, is what you're asking.
Just give us the top, maybe 3.
Oh my gosh. So, for something that you mentioned, a lot of us who grew up in the evangelical fundamentalist world, if you just look at fundamental, that's how they sucked you in. They said, this is going to be fun. Then you find out you're damned, and it makes you mental. And so,
yep. Yeah. Totally testify to that.
It's right there. So, I wrote a story on the train, for the most part, to one of my 3 jobs when we were living in a little tiny 900 square foot flat and rented. And Kim got a job at the high school bakery 2 blocks away. I'm cleaning toilets and doing shipping and receiving. We've got 4 of our 6 children still home. 2 are in college on scholarships. And we had nothing. It was one of the best times of our lives. And it really was. Very difficult on the one side, but very very freeing on the other side. That's, when you're in that sort of spot, you have a choice to either freak out or learn that the opposite of more is enough. And we did. We learned that the opposite of more is not less. The opposite of more is enough. And that was a very freeing time for us. So I didn't write this in order to publish it, in order to get an identity, in order to get some security. I made the 15 copies because I got some money at Christmas, and I had nothing else to give to my kids. And Kim, my wife, had been asking me to write something as a gift for our kids for about 4 years before this, and I did. Got it done, gave it to them for Christmas, and then so I gave the 15 copies, 6 to our kids. Kim got a copy, and the rest I gave to my friends. And I went back to work, and didn't cross my mind one time to publish it. I'd done it, I'd made these things on a little photocopier at Office Depot, and my friends started calling me up and saying, "Can I give this to my friends?" And I said, "Yeah, why not?" And so they did. And pretty soon I'm starting to get emails from people that I don't know. And they're not normal emails. They're not saying like, "Oh, this book has really, this was really a fun read," or "This was great." No, they're telling me, "Oh my gosh, this has absolutely changed the trajectory of my life." And then they would tell me their stories. So even around the story of how this all came to be, there are these little miraculous full circle kinds of golden thread stories they're just incredible. But I'll give you a couple. I'll give you a couple of the ones that, and I'm talking, we have thousands.
Yeah, no doubt.
In fact, one of the first emails that I got was from Australia, and a community, a family wrote to me, and the book had already made it to Australia. This is like 3 or 4 months after, because nobody would publish it. So a couple guys in California created a publishing company, and one of them volunteered to ship books out of his house at night because he was putting in people's sprinkler systems into their yards during the day. But that's how much they believed in this story. And it made it to Australia. I get a note, and the note says, "You have no idea what your book is doing here in our community. 7 members, no, what they said is, we've had a huge abuse situation where our grandfather pastor has just passed away, and it's come to light that there's been huge abuse. And this is in a Protestant environment. And they said, your book is giving us a way through. 7 of us have been through the shack, 4 to go."
Wow.
And I mean, that's one of the first emails I get. Another one, I get this letter, this note from northern Alberta up in Canada. And it's a photo, and I don't remember if they do this in Kiwi land or not, but in the U.S. and Canada, if there's been an accident on the road, a lot of times they make a little roadside memorial. You'll see a cross.
Yeah, we do that. Yeah.
Okay. And so this is a photo of a roadside memorial, and it was a situation was where a 4-year-old, had talked her dad into going to get them an ice cream cone, and both of them had been killed by an 18-wheeler, a big semi truck. And so they created this little memorial on the side of the road. But the reason they sent me the picture is on the post next to the memorial, someone had bungee corded a copy of The Shack. And it was just like, this is what's going to bring us help. Now I'll tell you again, one of those thousands of stories that I now have and have collected. And so the overwhelming response to The Shack and Crossroads has been absolutely incredible. Now, the only ones who I've gotten pushback on are on my own people, evangelical fundamentalists.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah, we will. The people who don't have to read it and know whether it's right or wrong. Anyway, but we'll talk about that. Ask me about the people who picketed me one time. So, so here's a story for you. I'm doing a book signing in central United States, and when I do a book, because I never published a book before, and I have no clue about what you do at a book signing. I basically have no clue about any of this, and And so I like to hug people. I think the world needs more hugs, especially safe ones. And so I don't sit behind a table, and I'll stand and talk to people in line, and I'll hug them. So this couple comes up to me, and there's a table behind me, and the woman just comes up and begins to sob, and the man just walks over to the table and he begins to put down photographs on the table. And between the two of them, they tell me their story. A year prior to us meeting, and they'd never heard of the shack, but their 21-year-old daughter had been hit and killed by a drunk driver, and only child. And it had devastated this couple. And it had sent especially the mom into a tailspin, a really dark depression, and for months. And both of them were sort of lost, as you know, and that's why I built the story around the loss of a child, because to me it's the greatest loss a human being can experience, and it is also one that asks the best questions. So they're laying down these photos, and they tell me that they were really stuck, especially the mom. She could not climb her way out of the depression. She just, every time she got close to it, she would something would spin her back into the abyss. And finally, her husband, in desperation, approached her with an idea and said, "You know, maybe we need to get out of town for a couple weeks. Maybe we just need to go drive, take a road trip. There are 2 states next to us that we have never been in our entire lives. It's just absolutely different territory. And why don't we take 2 weeks and we'll just drive? We'll go find a bed and breakfast. We'll explore the area, and we'll just change the scenery and everything that keeps reminding us, that spins us back into this." And surprisingly, she said, "I want to do that." So 8 months after the death of their daughter, they take this road trip, and they go a couple states over, and about 10 days into their road trip, they're 2 states away in territory that they've never been, and they decide they're going to get up in the morning, and they're going to get some stuff for a lunch, and they're going to make a lunch, and then they're going to go find a park, find a picnic bench, and sit in the park and have their lunch together. So, and they've got pictures of everything, right? So they've got photographs, and so they pack up in the morning, they pack up their lunch, and they go looking for a park. And it's a small little rural town, and it takes about 5 minutes to get out of town in any direction. And then there is just farms with roads and fields and fencing and mountains in the distant background, or hills. And they can't find a park. And they do concentric circles trying to find a park. You'd think they'd be able to find a park in this little town, and they couldn't find one. So they start going wider and wider around this town looking for a park. And in about an hour and something later, they were almost ready to give up and go back and say, "We'll just eat at the bed and breakfast that we stayed at." And the mother says, "Well, let's just try this road." And it was a paved road, and they took it about 5 or 6 miles way back into nowhere. And then she said, "Well, let's go down that one, which is a dirt road." So here's this couple 2 states away from home, in a place that nobody knows where they are, and they have no clue where they are. They don't know anything, right? And they're driving down this dirt road, and they get about a mile down this dirt road, and they look to the left as they're driving, and there's this huge field, and it looks like in the middle of the field there's a picnic table. And 50 yards beyond it, 50 meters beyond it, there is a fence, there is a little outbuilding of some sort, but other than that, there's nothing. There are no houses. It's just like ranch country. But it looks like there's a picnic table right in the middle of the field. And when you see the picture of it, it looks like a picnic table from the road. So they pick up all their stuff and they take it back. They pack it up and they say, "Well, there's nobody around. I mean, we'll eat there." Well, they get out to this thing, and it's not a picnic table. It turns out to be the stoop, stairway going up to a flat surface where there used to be a house there, some kind of a homestead or something that had either years and years ago burned down and been hauled away. And all that's left is the steps and the concrete, steps and surface, concrete and stone. And so it's not really a picnic table, but it's got a flat surface, they haven't seen one. This is as close as they've got. So they decided, well, we'll just put our little tablecloth here and we'll eat our lunch, which they did. About halfway through the lunch, the wife looks out past toward the fence line and says, see that little outbuilding? There's a little sign above the door. It's a little oval-shaped sign, a white sign. Can you read what it says? And he's squinting and he goes, no, I'll go look. So he walks over there and he comes back and he says, it says the shack. Means nothing to them. He just says, it says the shack. Huh. Okay. Well, they finish eating. They pack up. They're on their way back to the car. And she suddenly stops, the mom. And she says, I'm going to go in there. And her husband is confused and says, oh, you're going to go in where? She says, the shack. I'm going to go in the shack. He goes, I don't know if that's a good idea. What if there's somebody actually living in this? This is a little tiny one, very, very small little shed. What if there's somebody in there? She goes, I don't care. So she heads off and he follows her over and she doesn't knock, nothing. She walks right into this little outbuilding and they've got pictures of every wall inside this, and there are no windows. It's got 4 walls. It's got, on one wall, there's a desk. On the desk, there's a light. There is a sign-up sheet of some sort. There's a notice, and then there are 2 copies of a book that they've never heard. And the notice says, please take whatever you need. And the sign-up shows that a dozen people have come by and signed their names and what states they were from or whatever. And she picks up one of the copies of the book. And I'm in this receiving line to sign it. And she picks it up and it's the shack. And she says to me, she is weeping. She says, this book saved my life.
Wow. Wow.
So somebody had been touched in their heart by reading the book, and they set up this little tiny shed out in the middle of nowhere. And God was just leading people out in the middle of nowhere in order to give them a copy of the shack. Yeah. And you just go like, you couldn't make that up. And I'm looking at the photographs, and it is exactly what they're telling me. And that is one of the thousands of stories.
Wow. Wow. Oh, that's incredible. That's amazing. Yeah, I suppose, just to sort of set a context for people who will listen to this, who obviously there are some people in the world who haven't heard of the shack. I'm curious to ask, and there is a reason I'm asking this, not just to sort of promote you selflessly, but shamelessly, but how many copies of the shack actually ended up being sold?
Are we talking about the underground Chinese versions as well?
Overall,
the actual for real copies of the shack are probably in excess of 22 million.
Yeah. Wow.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, that's crazy. And I'm just curious, when you start to hear some of these, like you say, these now thousands of stories, what does that do for you as an author? This is, like you said, this was completely unintentional in the sense that would even sort of become this. And it seemed clear to me, I guess, when you get to, numbers like 22 million, it's like something is happening here that's beyond just a single person. I think that's probably fair to say.
It's important for everybody to understand that when I made those first 15 copies at Office Depot, they did everything I ever wanted that book to do.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I had a huge amount of freedom just being like, oh my gosh, what is this? I have no clue. We laughed about it all the time. We still do. And you just shake your head going, oh, look at God's great sense of humor.
Yeah.
And to use a Hebrew scripture reference, obviously if he can speak through Balaam's ass, he can probably speak through anybody. And
yeah.
And so, the beauty of it is that nobody saw it coming. And it's crazier than you even think. It's the number 2 book in the history of Brazil. It is the number one book by anybody outside of Brazilian Portuguese to ever write a book that's had that kind of impact. It was adopted by Croatia as the book of the decade for the country, and the Ministry of Culture asked me to come and speak to the country. I mean, you start looking at how this thing has broken across barriers. I don't know anybody else that gets invited to the Atheist Book Club, to a New Age conference in Europe, and to Southern Baptist Seminary, or to the National Conference of Catholic Cemetery Directors, or the Cowboy Hall of Fame Museum. You know, you start looking at the diversity that's involved in the conversation, and you realize, you know what? This is not a religious book. This is not a Christian book. This is a human book. And,
I was about to say the same thing.
Yeah, and the beauty of that is that, you know, I've lived long enough and thankfully been through enough and had to do the hard work to get to a place where I've been able to write about human things and still have this connection at the center of everything with an absolute unflinching affection for the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, while pushing off religion generally. And religion, you know, that's a term that's religion is an easy target, and religious systems have done incredibly good things, but have caused incredible amounts of damage as well, and devastation and divisiveness and everything else, and continues to do that.
Yeah. So I guess just by way of sort of switching gears a little bit, I mean, it's interesting you talk about the whole, you know, not being a religious book, but a human book. It does remind me, and again, you know, it's bringing up a name like Rob Bell is probably an easy way to transition to controversy, but I remember something he said in his sort of transition away from being a pastor, you know, in a church to sort of doing what he's doing now, when he sort of said something along the lines of, to talk about Jesus and his message is to talk about being human. You know, it's not just a Christian. He's like, I thought this message was for Christians. He's like, no, this is for humans. That's what you've sort of tapped into as well. So, I guess, you know, to sort of flip across to a little bit of the negative side of it. And I think I kind of know, I can imagine some of your responses based on what you've said so far. But obviously we did talk last week briefly about, you know, there is the infamous clip by Mark Driscoll basically standing up in front of his congregation and saying, Christians are going nuts over this book, The Shack. And he says, you know, if you haven't read it, don't. Right. Which, you know, we did laugh about it, the fact that the moment you say no to someone or tell them not to do something, it just creates controversy and curiosity. And they're like, okay.
I owe that brother, let me tell you. He probably sold more copies of The Shack for me than any other single human being on the planet. And just for that reason, you know that to take your case a little bit further, there's a denomination in Australia. Sorry to knock on the Aussies like this, but you know,
I'm talking New Zealand. It's fine.
I'm talking to a Kiwi, so it's we have a lot of those kind of rivalries around here too. But the denomination banned The Shack as heresy, and so they had a leadership conference, and they told all their pastors and such to communicate to their congregations that there's this new book out, it's a heresy, and tell your congregation to stay away from it. So Baxter Kruger, who's a PhD in theology, he is a church historian, theologian, who's become a dear friend of mine. He wrote a book called The Shack Revisited, which is looking at the theology, and it's brilliant. And so he and I were on a sort of a speaking tour in Australia. And one of the places we were at was in Adelaide. And this person comes up to us in Adelaide and goes, "Oh, I've got a great story for you." So he tells us about the denomination banning The Shack as heresy. And he said, you know, that was a couple of years ago. He says, and then about 8 months ago, there was a pastoral change in that church. And so they had a big announcement, you know, come meet the new pastor and his wife, afternoon tea, Q&A. And during the questions, somebody raises their hand and says, "Have you read anything good lately?" And he says, this new pastor's wife, who obviously hadn't gotten the word, whips The Shack out of her purse, raises it up and says, oh my gosh, this is the single best book I've ever read. How many of you have read it? And they said 3/4 of the congregation raised their hand. You
Oh,
know,
that's fantastic.
in Romans it says where the law comes, sin abounds.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
this don't do it. Oh, come on. The my I love the controversy because my identity's not in it. I don't write to stir it up. I write to ask the questions and to validate the questions. And so, an angry person is much more engaged than an ambivalent person. A person who just doesn't care, there's really no conversation. And when somebody is upset and they're coming to talk to me, which they usually don't, most religious upset people tell other people. They don't actually talk to the person that they're mad at. And but when they do, I'm at a place in my life, thank God, where I know to the core of my being that this person is not coming to tell me about me. They're not coming to tell me about Paul Young because I know who I am. I know where I've come from. And so they're coming in the only way they know how to tell me about them, to tell me what matters to them, to tell me what scares them. And if I am not at risk in the conversation, then I can hear. And great things happen because of that. I'm not at risk. And you know what? I've been wrong about a bunch of stuff. And so that's not the point. I was telling you that I had my first protesters, and it was in Orlando, Florida. And I get to this venue. I'm speaking to like 2,000 people, and there's picketers all around, and the bullhorns and the signs and all this. And I thought it was an anti-abortion thing or something. And I did. So I'm going like, okay, what are the picketers about? And they look at me, they laugh, they go, Paul, they're here because of you. I'm going, are you serious?
You're that
picketers?
disconnected from the controversy.
Yeah, I got picketers. And I'm thinking, I was cleaning toilets and I got protesters? Like, how cool is this?
Amazing. I love it.
My kids are going to love this. So it was like 100 degrees outside. These guys, poor guys, they're working up a sweat, and it's sort of my fault. And so I went in and got a case of water because it's hot. So I went out there and I'm handing them bottles of water. And one of the guys I'm handing him a water, and he goes, so do you work here? And I go,
he doesn't have a clue who you are.
no. I go, no. He says, then why are you coming and handing out water? I said, I wrote the book you're mad about. He goes, what?
That's awesome.
So they all gather around, and for 15 minutes we talk. And I come to find out that not one of the protesters had read it.
No, of course.
Not one. And I'm going like, oh, you guys, you are so my family. Oh my gosh. I grew up with you guys. I mean, I totally get you. And I'm inviting them into the evening, and they're going like, no, we got so, and it's crazy that how we do this. But as soon as I walk away, they're back on the bullhorn. This violates the principles of God. This, the whole spang. I'm going like, oh my gosh, human beings,
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
It is.
I love that you shared that. I love that you shared that personally, because for me in my journey and the transitions and things I've made have I almost have this fear on the other side of like, I almost don't want anything to do with these fundamentalists, and because it sort of, reminds me of where I've come from. I was just like, I'd rather push that away, but I'm sort of being challenged now to this place of going, hang on a minute, I don't want to go to the other extreme where I start dehumanizing them in the way that they can.
Exactly. Exactly.
So
one of my favorite passages, and I think Scripture is full of humor because I think humor originates in God, and so I think Paul the Apostle is a very funny guy. People don't think about him that way, but I think he is. There's this one, he's writing to Timothy, who is his protege, and Paul's sort of the mentor. And Timothy is in a situation in Ephesus which is kind of messy. There's all kinds of things going on that aren't the best, and so Timothy is caught into some of the politics of church stuff. And Paul's writing to him, and he's got this great line. And you've got to know that it's tongue-in-cheek, because he says, here is a statement that is true and worthy of full acceptance, that Jesus Christ is the Savior of all mankind, especially believers. And you just go like, you've so been in church, and I see those are my people, and I always say, be careful about how you talk about them, because you're talking about my people, and they are incredibly precious to me. I come from that, and so I get it. I know how hard it is and how scary it is to move out of it, and but if Jesus had said, okay, so here is the mission field, and this is the hardest community to reach. Who would have been inside the hardest community to reach? It would have always been the religious people. They were always the ones that were the most difficult, because they thought they knew everything and were right about it. And and I were that person. So I have great mercy for those who are still stuck in that kind of thing, because I know how lonely it is, and I know how devastating it is, and I know how destructive it is to human relationships.
Yeah, it's funny, because you start to, even in this sort of podcast, and we've been going about 3 months now, and it's interesting because you start connecting with different people online, and you can sort of get a feel for who you're talking to, because they start asking you straight away, like, oh, what do you believe? Like, what are your doctrines and stuff like that? I'm just like, whoa, like, don't you want to just like talk to me as a person first, like, before we just start deconstructing like theology and get into like all this kind of nuanced discussion? And I'm just like, but it's interesting, and I'd be interested to sort of dive into that a little bit, like the sort of impulses behind it. This sort of addiction to certainty, as Peter Rollins wrote a book called The Idolatry of God, which was sort of dived into that, and that sort of impulse to want to know all the answers. And the way I like to say it for myself experientially is, looking back to the time when I was so certain, it's almost like my faith was more in having the answers than it was in God, if that makes sense. Correct.
Because then you didn't have to take the risk of relationship. All you had to do is be smart enough.
Yeah, and I still don't like to take the risk of relationship in general, to be honest.
But that's the movement that you're in, and that's the movement that God will constantly drive us toward. This is the attraction of pornography, and religious certainty is very similar to pornography, right? The addiction to pornography and the addiction to religious certainty are very similar. It is the imagination of a relationship without the risk of a real one.
Yeah,
right? Because you don't have to deal with trust. So in religious certainty, there is an imagination of a relationship with God, but it's based on propositional truths that I have control over, right? So I don't have to take the risk of actually trusting God, of actually exposing the brokenness of my heart so that there's a possibility of healing. I have certainty. And the same with the pornography, right? I can have an imagination of a relationship in which there is no risk. And I think that that's really what it's supposed to be like. And it's not. It's absolutely corrupted. So I would put those things in very similar categories.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm glad that's an interesting topic to raise. We could probably do a whole podcast on something like that, I think. Obviously, I did, I powered through the audiobook of Eve, so I guess we could maybe just change gears towards that, I guess. Loved it. Totally enjoyed it. Don't know if I completely understood it.
Well, that's, good luck with that, because Shack is like that, and Crossroads is definitely like that, and Eve is layered like that as well.
It is layered. It's totally layered. I almost got it by immersion, I think. I was just kind of like, good. Okay, I don't fully understand that, but I'm going to keep listening. And I was like, it sort of clicks a little bit more. I was just like, but here's, I guess, again, and I did say to you, I'm not so much interested in sort of deconstructing the book itself and going, oh, what did this part mean? What did, because I think that does a disservice to your art, to be honest. But what I do find compelling to talk about is the themes. I guess this disclaimer or this sort of thing that says, if the shack, shattered your misconceptions of God, then Eve will essentially shatter your misconceptions of humanity. So there is this sort of contrasting sort of premise. So can you speak to that a little bit? Like if you
Absolutely.
can sort of, yeah.
The in the shack, and when I write, I'm as I kind of mentioned before, is that I write around questions because questions have become really important to me. There's a line in the first chapter of Eve where Eve says to the character John, says, something to the effect of, choose your question carefully. One good question is worth 1,000 answers. And I love questions. So the question in the shack was the goodness of God in the midst of the tragedy and the devastation of what human beings do to each other or experience in the brokenness of this world. And in Crossroads, the question is, so what if you have fortified yourself against relationship and you don't want change and you don't want transformation? How does grace get inside that kind of fortress? And so that's a different exploration of a different question. The question in Eve has to do with our humanity. Who are we as human beings, and why or how did we go so wrong? And what does it look like to begin for that conversation to change? And so of the 3 books, Eve is by far the most difficult because I wanted to do a service respectfully to the scholarship and to the text itself, and because I'm really focused on Genesis 2 and 3, and but I want to re-narrate that story in a way and I think in an accurate way, much more accurate than the paradigm or the way that we have narrated it traditionally. Which I think is an overlay upon the text and because of our broken assumptions. But I wanted to keep it inside an accessible story, something that a teenager could read and, like you, maybe not fully comprehend, but get it at a very visceral level. They can see things with the heart that they can't comprehend with the mind, or they can't deconstruct with the mind. And I think good art does that. You don't see a piece of work that's artistic and deconstruct it down to the bits of paint. That's you lose the impact of the communication of the beauty of what's going on. Not that you can't deconstruct this, because you can. I mean, I didn't write this out of nowhere. Eve is the product of more than 40 years of work. On the scholarship side, and scholars will recognize it when they read it, and already have. So they see that layer in a way that other people won't. But that's been true in all my books. Crossroads has some really layered things that you would not pick up if you're just reading it for a story. And same with The Shack. You could read it just as a story, but you could also read it as this incredible movement of the healing of the human heart. Well, same with Eve. And same with Crossroads. So there's these major themes about who are we as human beings? What is God's view of humanity? What is it? Where did evil originate in a very good creation? And how then? What are the implications of this? And I don't know what you thought of the first or the last 5 chapters, but I thought the last 5 chapters are among the best things that I've ever done in my entire life.
Yeah. I love that you talk about, you sort of said about the concept of God's view of humanity, but I think it also asks the question of humans' view of humanity as well in many ways.
Well, I don't think you can disentangle those questions one from the other, because a lot of times it is, especially if you've come from any sort of religious background, your view of God implicitly has a view of anthropology, humanity. And in the Western tradition, in yours and my tradition, God has had a very low view of humanity. And we have had a very yeah. Well, and that's an issue, because if you start with total depravity, then we really have no hope in terms of ontology, in terms of who we are as beings. And we do. In the Western theology, we start with separation, and we start with depravity, that a human being is a piece of crap. And and then it's just that, God in his mercy reaches out through Jesus.
Yeah, it's insane. It blows my mind. And I guess, since we did get a little bit
but
theological.
Listen how powerful that is. Every human being that I've ever met begins with an incredibly low view of themselves, unless they're an absolute narcissist. But even a narcissist is someone who is covering up the fact that they feel completely ashamed of who they are. And so the question is, how do I get to be enough? Because I'm worthless, I'm a piece of crap, I am not smart enough, I am not skinny enough, I'm not beautiful, I'm not of the right color, I'm not of the right origin, and on and on and on it goes.
According to Calvinism, it's just random selection, basically.
Yeah, and of which Calvin wouldn't have agreed, but Yeah.
It's crazy. I mean, I came from that stream. I mean, I did street preaching for a number of years, and that was essentially the message that I was peddling was, you have to realize how depraved you are so that you can see how good God is. And it's just, I look at it now and I cringe because it's so toxic and it's so soul destroying because you don't have a chance. You don't have, and this is what I love about your work, because you do, I mean, it's almost, I would almost go as far as to say the word disturbing sometimes in a good way, but it disrupts you, and it's kind of like, okay, this is different. Like, you're using these terms I'm familiar with, but this is like a whole new terrain, and I'm just like, wow, like it's unfamiliar in a beautiful way, if that can make sense.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think when you're dealing with things that are true for human beings, it will resonate way beyond as Lewis would call them, the watchful dragons of our minds. And, we've got all these guards set up against it, and then art and music. This is my friend Baxter. He says, why do you think that Presbyterian pastors will go to an Elton John concert, Elton John, who would represent everything that they disagree with, and they will stand there. These are Presbyterian Reformed leaders who will stand there with their hands raised at an Elton John concert, swaying to the music and lighting their little, well, now iPhones, but in the past cigarette lighters, and it's like, you know what? The beauty of the presence of the Holy Spirit inside of humanity, and I believe the Holy Spirit has been poured out on all flesh, like it says in Acts 2, that emerges in terms of the arts, and it calls to us in terms of our humanity back towards things that are true. And we have a natural resonance with that and an affinity. Everybody I know, no matter how broken they are, has a desire to move toward authenticity. Why? It's because it's totally ingrained in terms of the imago Dei in us. God is an authentically whole community of relationship.
There was one particular line that I did sort of resonate with from Eve that I just wanted to sort of talk about, which was towards the end, where I think it was like Lily basically says, "Can I climb the mountain of trust?" And the response was, "You already are, my dear one." And I love that. I was like, I just had this like moment of like, okay, that's amazing. And I love that idea. To me, and this is something I did want to talk about a little bit, was this idea of, with what happened in Eden and the separation. And it's like this, it's almost like it is an illusion in a way, like this, like, the Bible goes on to say things like, neither height nor depth nor angels nor demons or anything can separate us from the love of God. So we were never separated from the love of God. The Bible makes it abundantly clear, right?
We were never separated from God. Or like Bart says, you would lapse into non-being. Creation, creation is created in Jesus, and it never is going to be separated. Not anything that has come into being has come into being apart from him. So separation is a myth. And it's a theological myth that has dominated the Western landscape.
Yeah. And I mean, just to go back into that line a little bit, because I just, I think the whole idea that by very virtue of asking the question, you're already in process to healing.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? Absolutely. I love that.
And trust is the issue. Trust is a relational reality, and it's based on the character of the one that you're coming to know. You can't trust someone that you don't think really loves you. And to the degree of fear, according to 1 John, the degree of fear in your life is parallel to the degree that you don't know yet how much you're loved. And so there is this movement, because the opposite of being loved and trusting is being fearful and controlling. That we have to have everything controlled around us. That is a response to fear in opposition to trust. If you have an imagination of God in which God is not good all the time, that there is a little darkness, that like the darkness of God is represented by God the Father, who is the darkness behind Jesus. Because I grew up in that reality where Jesus indeed came to save me, but he came to save me from God the Father. It was God the Father who was so ticked off, distant, unapproachable, unreachable, unknowable, watching from the infinite distance of a disapproving heart. And it was Jesus who came to create a barrier between that darkness in God and the fact that I was a piece of crap. And so this sense of separation was always tentative, and Jesus was kind of coming between me, the child, and the abusive parent, God the Father. And so that totally impacts our ability to trust. So we say, because religion will teach you how to say that you trust God, but we don't. Trust is the big issue in any relationship, right? For a relationship to be real, there has to be knowing that happens, and there has to be trusting, because loving will continue to expand around knowing. But this issue of trust is based on character. And if you've got a mythology about the character of God, in which God, kills babies and sacrifices and does all this stuff and is willing to pour out his own wrath on an innocent son in order to be right with other people, all of that mythology, you're going to ask me, I come from a sexual abuse history, a very angry father, on and on and on, religious, all of that stuff, and you're going to ask me to trust, right? It's taken me 36 years of marriage where not only have I become a trustworthy man, but I've learned how to trust, even in my marriage, because, you walk into a marriage, you lose control, and you're entering a mystery because you're dealing with person. This is why we love propositions and law and objective truth and mind stuff, because then we don't have to take the risk of relationship. That's why I was making that analogy to pornography and how similar they are, and because they're based on imagination. Yeah, trust is at the center of everything.
Yeah, no, exactly. I suppose, just in, I guess in sort of winding down a little bit, I feel like I could talk to you all day, to tell you the truth. To sort of get quite practical in a sense, like, where do we begin? Like, you're very, candid about your own history and your story, and I love that, because that's, I'm starting to sort of value that in my own life, about sort of owning my story and my past and saying, hey, this is where I've come from and this is part of who I am. So to people who, who would potentially listen to this conversation and what we're talking about and sort of resonate with it, maybe they've come from a broken home or, dysfunctional church, sort of life, or whatever it may be, I guess. They may be non-religious completely, but where do we sort of, I don't know, I'm not saying, well, give us the 3 steps kind of thing, but where's a good starting point to sort of own your history and own your life and begin that process of sort of healing, I guess you could say?
You let somebody in. And I'm not talking about just God, because, we'd love God to heal us apart from anybody else finding out about our crap. But healing will not happen outside the embrace of community. It will not. And if that means a therapist, if that's the safest place to start, but you find somebody who you have some sense of safety with, and you begin to unpack this with an intention of movement toward wholeness. And we're also addicted to the prisons that we found ourselves in. You grow up with a certain prison, and that becomes what is normal to you, and anything that is freedom related scares the crap out of you. So we want to go back to our own prisons. We get an identity in terms of our prisons, and we have to be willing to let those go. But this is hard work. What I'm talking, the reformation of the soul is hard work, and it's humiliating in some respects, because the exposure, you've got to say, my coming to wholeness is more important than my reputation. It's more important than these other things. I want to be a whole human being. And thankfully, see, I love the person of Jesus, because Jesus doesn't come to start a new religion. Jesus came to show us what it's like to be fully human and fully alive.
Yes. Oh man, I've been resonating with that idea for a while now. I love that. That's, that is amazing. I love that you just said that. That's so true. That's so true. And that's what I love about, again, just your work and your writing, because it sort of, most people, I find, I'm at a point in my life, as I say, I've been through the church, I've kind of burnt out myself, and anyone, like, I sort of get my back up to the wall anytime somebody starts talking about these, God and Jesus and theology, and I'm just like, I'm done with it. But then I hear you talking about it in this like beautiful, like expansive way, and I'm just like, I can resonate with this. I'm okay with this conversation,
because it's human. The incarnation, Jesus or God fully taking on identification and form with us as human. That is God's high view of humanity, not God's low view of humanity. And this interaction of face-to-face relationship, which is a dominant theme in Eve, becomes absolutely essential for me to begin to move toward wholeness myself. And it's highly respectful for even the crap that I do bring to the table, because I brought plenty. Things that were stolen from me, that were broken in me, that I turned around and then began to perpetrate also. And it's like, oh, is there hope? And I'm telling you there is. The shack is the house on the inside that people help you build. And a lot of us, we did not get good help. And so it was this devastated place. It's where we hid all of our addictions and hid all of our secrets. And we never wanted anybody to enter that place, because we were so terrified that we would see in their face the same self-hatred we saw every time we looked in a mirror. And so we create a facade, something that we hope would perform well enough so that we could win some sense of affection and approval, and it doesn't work. And because it's disconnected to who we are. God is not there to destroy the shack. He's there, he is indwelling it in order to help us reconstruct us, participate with us in our own coming to healing. And it is a process. As much as we would like, extreme soul makeover, it doesn't work like that. This is a process. This is work.
It is a process. And there's you can't skip the valley, I guess. You can't skip the valley. Like, you've got to go through it.
Nor would you want to.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I've said the same thing, where I look at the things I've been through and I'm just like, I wouldn't change it for the world, because it's part of it's part of who I am. It's part of what's shaped me. So
yeah, but I'd never want to go through it again either.
Yes, I can totally agree.
Let's
totally
be clear.
It's behind us.
I'm so grateful for the process and what it did. But it's like looking at the cross. The cross is not God's idea. The cross is human beings. So we created this monster torture device, so God submits to it. This is a God who submits by nature. This is a God who climbs onto our torture device in order to transform what we brought to the table into an icon and a monument of grace.
Yeah, fantastic. Awesome. I guess that's a great sort of point to stop there. I just want to, to say to people who are listening, go to Amazon, get Paul Young's books, check them out. Obviously, you've got The Shack and you've got Crossroads and then Eve. Is there anything in your brain rattling around at the moment in the future? Like, what's next for you?
Let's see. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of my grandchildren just outside the door. So what's next for me is to go build some Legos and read a book and to my grandbabies. So that you learn to live inside the grace of a day. Tomorrow, I could be dead by tomorrow. I'm not going to waste today's grace on imaginations that don't exist.
Nice. Fair enough. I like it. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mark, it's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you for giving me the time. So appreciate it. Appreciate you.